people always ask, what is my purpose? And I always want to say, what kind of cruel vision do you have of this universe that it would be that you get born with a purpose and no one tells you what it is? How would that ever make sense in anyone's universe? Whether it's a God in control of it or if nature in control of it, it just makes no sense. Surely your purpose must be to be what you were born as and try and be that as best as possible. And that really doesn't mean, okay, I'll just accept this one thing. It just means locate your consciousness back at yourself, self-reflect, keep on using the mirror and maximize what works well in your life, minimize what doesn't, but don't pretend you're something else because that isn't going to work for you.
I think the problem is we've conflated purpose with something that we do in the world. It's so endemic in our culture that when we meet people, we say, what do you do? We don't ask, who are you? Welcome. I'm Dr. Maria Christodoulou, and this is the Awakening Doctor podcast, a space where we discover the personal stories of those who work in the medical and health professions. Join me as I explore the hopes, the fears, the aspirations, and the real-life challenges of those who carry the title, responsibility, and privilege of being a doctor. Very nice to be here with you today.
I'm so looking forward to this chat.
Me too. I think there's so much that we could talk about. I should start just by saying a little bit about who you are and how we came to know each other. I think it was probably the year 2000 when I came for my first astrology reading.
Well, officially that's the last century. That's something that everyone gets wrong, but that's still their last century. So it's been a century.
It's been a century. Crazy. So for those who don't know, Rod Suskin is a very well-known astrologer and also a Sangoma with a particular interest in the history of traditional medicine, both African and Western, and has written several books on astrology. You've lectured, you've done a master's degree in the cosmology of medicine and healing.
Of African medicine, of Sangomas.
Also in the room with us is Amy Kay, writer and narrative coach, and the producer and editor of the Awakening Doctor podcast. So it feels like there are so many different things we could talk about today. But I particularly wanted us to start with the history of medicine because I'm firmly of the belief or the opinion that you have to understand the history of something to make sense of where we find ourselves now and where we might be headed and how we've created some of the situations that are problematic about medicine in the world today.
That's very big for me. It's one of the things that got me even more into it. But I was once lecturing at UCT Medical School, pleased to discover the students can choose some of their guest lecturers, so they chose me once. And I started off thinking, okay, at least I've got a medically literate audience because I'm going to be talking about medicine in a previous century.
Right.
Because of astrology. So I said, so how much history of medicine do you know? And everyone looked at me awkwardly until one student stood up and said, well, we've been taught one thing about the history of medicine. And I said, what was that? And he said that it was all wrong. And I was horrified. At a university, I felt bad for them. That's the old cliche, you're going to repeat your mistakes.
Right. So there's also history of medicine that might get taught in medical schools, which is about Galen and Hippocrates. But there's a history that doesn't get told that often, and that's the one you and I have chatted about before that I'm particularly interested in, and kind of has its roots in Western astrology. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the origins of astrology and how it was related to medicine.
When we say it has its roots in astrology, it has its roots in the same philosophies that astrology does. And I think what we live in a world where everything, including our ideas, are very fragmented. And despite the fact that even with modern sciences, where we learn more and more how there aren't boundaries between things, and even the theory of the atom tells us that we're all mostly space, nothing is discrete, all of those don't seem to stop us from fragmenting everything. In the ancient world, people saw the world as one thing, and everything was unified, in some way related to each other. So to them it was logical that if the theory of the world is that fundamentally four elements, say fire, earth, and water, then that must apply to everything. And that allowed them, although sometimes presumably being wrong, as we still are, because we do still want to categorize everything neatly, but still that allowed them to create these holistic ways of understanding the world, of understanding themselves, and a holistic system of medicine.
Right.
And that's, to me, what's so lost in the loss of the history of medicine. The one thing about history of medicine that people seem to override is that something must have been working if those people kept on doing it.
Right.
If they weren't getting any results, they would have tried something else eventually. Everyone would have been dead and ill. That's the part that people should be asking, why did it work, rather than just say, oh, well, it was wrong because it wasn't this. I remember that it's 1961 that the Surgeon General tells us that smoking is bad for your health. And everyone, darn, we finally got to put our cigarettes down. It slowly starts from there. But there's a quote that I often like to show people that lists the consequences of smoking, which is really all the ones we do know, through all the illnesses, emphysemas and cancers. But the interesting thing is the quote looks like it must be post-Surgeon General, but it was by King James I. It was said by him. And people were smoking tobacco, and it hadn't been for long. And already all those illnesses were manifest, because, it will be within the first generation of people who smoke. And they recognized what those illnesses were and why they were. They recognized that it was tobacco that was causing them, because it was obvious, really. It's like eat poison, you die. Tobacco does that. And the king complained that it's killing his subjects, and he can't allow this. And his advisors explained, well, terribly sorry, Your Majesty, but you're earning a lot of tax from it.
Right.
And he was caught because he had no other money. Our idea that royalty were always rich is not at all true. It's only modern royalty that are rich. And to this very day, even our government and most governments around the world get a healthy tax revenue from tobacco. That is why it is legal.
Interesting.
Which is astonishing, because apart from the renegades and the tobacco companies themselves, there's no one who doesn't understand how dangerous a poison it is. And yet we allow that one because it produces money.
So talking about royalty kind of also brings me to the Royal College of Physicians and how that was established and what that meant for medicine and healing. There was this natural wisdom, there was this holistic philosophy, and then there comes a time when slowly but surely the power is taken away from the people who hold that knowledge and that wisdom. I know you've kind of explored that area quite a lot. I'm curious about your take on the role of astrology, the role of the healers, the midwives, the barbers.
I think many people at least know the story of the witches. Witches were endlessly persecuted wherever they were found. Most of them were what we call nowadays wise women. Women and men who were versed in herbal knowledge that had been passed down for unimaginable generations, literally since the beginning of human beings beginning to interact and organize their societies that way. So they had profound herbal knowledge over generations, and we know even animals acquire herbal knowledge given long enough, and most of them have it. So it was a really unimaginably rich body of knowledge that, again, worked. Even most medicines today are still based on their original herbal ingredients. And from the wise women and men to various practitioners of astrology, very often astrologers were also versed in herbalism. Barbers, as you know, who generally practiced surgery. There were two things that started happening. On the one hand, there were those people who thought surgery could be improved, it shouldn't be in the hands of barbers. And there were those people who also began to feel threatened by the fact that these astrologers and people like that had all this herbal knowledge. Medicine went into the universities as surgery.
Right.
Originally, it was the effort to improve upon what the barbers were doing, because surgery unmistakably works. To me, surgery is what is good about Western medicines. And as they begin to discover what they can do and they get amazing results, goes into the universities, and eventually the Royal College of Surgeons is formed. Surgeons were, of course, not doctors. And to this day, we have a tradition that surgeons aren't even called doctors. And eventually, they appealed to the king, wanting to be the only people who were allowed to practice medicine. Within the medical world, herbal knowledge was very poor, because it was mostly based on inherited superstitions and beliefs rather than the inherited actual practice of all these wise women and men who'd been passed on forever. So you look at what the herbalists were practicing, which is very similar to herbal medicine today, compared with what the then early doctors were practicing. And they were the ones who were so threatened. So they went to the king, they said, we want to be the only ones to practice medicine. It took them a while to persuade them, but eventually he did create a law. And he said the herbalists can dispense the medicines, but they can't diagnose, and they can't even know what it is. They made a law that says textbooks about medicine and prescriptions need to be written in Latin. And so the things are labeled in Latin, and the idea was that the doctor who'd been trained at the Royal College would send a piece of paper to the herbalist, who could then read the Latin names, take the things out of the jars, but not know what they are.
Right. But that was was also because you could only learn Latin if you were educated.
Yes, so that's why they used Latin, because the chances were that the herbalists wouldn't know it.
Right.
Of course, the herbalists could recognize the herbs. They didn't think of that. And then a great astrologer came along and thought something's got to change. So that astrologer was Nicholas Culpeper. And so Culpeper and William Lilly, the most famous English astrologer of the 17th century, Culpeper was primarily a herbalist. He's the one, to this very day, most of our herbal knowledge that we have is because of him. And what he did is he took the materia medica in Latin. He translated the entire thing into English. He added all the astrology of the plants and he published it. And that book, outside of the Bible, is the best-selling book in history. And many people nowadays know it as Culpeper's Herbal. Most people who just ordinarily grow herbs in their gardens use that book. But the original version, which is still in print, is the one that also contains all the astrology, as well as all the section on how to prepare these into medicines. And so he's very instrumental in the development of modern medicine. He still is using the original holistic system, and astrology is in there. And what was always appealing about astrology is that it's the practical expression of those early philosophies of elements, of the balances of energies in the world. It explains it literally. It says, well, this plant is full of that planet. You can literally see who's got what balance. And that allowed a system of medicine to develop. But what the king had done is that he'd split it. So it became illegal for herbalists to practice medicine. All they were allowed to do was receive the piece of paper and give the medicine.
I'm a modern person and I have a health issue and I come and see an astrologer. How are you going to help me?
So the one thing, of course, we have to accept, I guess, about astrology, which also ties in with our modern way of seeing the world, is that in many ways, everything is there from the beginning. Just like our entire genetic pattern, our DNA, everything is there right from the moment we're born. And some smart geneticists could look at our DNA and make a whole bunch of predictions about us. We know, like everything else in nature, it's on a scale. So they'll say you're 90% likely to suffer from that, but only 50% likely to suffer from that.
Well, they talk about low penetrance and high penetrance genes. So if you have a high penetrance gene, you will express that issue. So the gene for Down syndrome is a high penetrance gene. But then you have low penetrance genes, which may or may not express depending on your lifestyle choices, your environment.
So some things might switch genes on.
Right.
So astrology is a similar model. It says, here's a model of your entire self, from your emotional self to your body. So we can see in your astrological chart, your moment of birth, your DNA, what the tendencies or potentials of your body might be. We follow the similar idea that things still need to be switched on.
Right.
The potential sits there. It's not necessarily going to automatically manifest. The parallel to high penetrance is this system of measurements of strength that astrology uses to show how likely is something to express itself. And so the astrologer can look and see which planets then are associated with the body area of your chart and which planets are associated with the disease area of the chart. And then based on the disease one, we can identify what is likely to happen, or in a specific situation, what systems it might involve. I'm remembering my father, when I was a kid, I was so into chemistry, mostly because I wanted to make fireworks and blow things up, like most kids. But,
I don't know about most kids.
Well, what are you supposed to do if they give you a chemistry set for Christmas?
Fair enough.
Let's blow something up. We used to get little toys in cereal boxes. Those were the things I wanted to blow.
I remember those.
And I remember my father explaining the theory of how the atom worked to me. And so you could then figure out, if you had two chemicals, what was going to result. That's why he taught it to me, and it worked fantastically. And I made little inventions out of that, and the whole system of how the atom's valency and it looks for the other electrons, and I loved all of that. Then when I finally got to high school and got to chemistry, and it turned out that everything my father taught me was completely wrong, because when he was at school, that was the model of the atom. But in the years since, they developed electron microscopes and everything else, and they discovered, that was completely wrong. We've got a whole new model of the atom, but that one worked. It worked so well that I could make specific chemicals in my little home lab and blow up my toy correctly, even though the model of the atom was completely wrong. Wow. So I must assume even our model of the atom today, in 100 years' time, are going to be laughing at us. Why science uses models is precisely because it's a working system. It's not necessarily a true description of reality, but it's a working system.
It reflects our current understanding of how things work.
And that's what astrology probably is. I'm stuck on these ideas of influence and even a sphere. They're just really words to explain something we don't know, but the practical result is the model, and the model works. It might sound weird if I say I'm categorizing my herbs by the moon, but the end result is, because this really comes at the end of thousands of years of experience, I've actually landed up categorizing all the things that fight that type of illness together.
Right. So let's talk more about 12-year-old you, because I remember an interesting story about how you started studying astrology. I think it was something about a tarot card pack in a shop window.
That was how I started doing tarot cards.
Okay.
Astrology, I was 12 years old and I went on holiday with my family, and they bumped into a friend of theirs who was sitting there drawing charts by hand. And I already knew about my own astrology, so I asked a million questions and sent him home and said, read this book. But the tarot cards had come earlier than that, because I did have all the strange stuff as a child that we now know is the Sangoma part of me, because it started very much earlier when I used to have dreams when I was very little of sitting by a river with this man dressed in black who played cards with me. But the cards just had geometric shapes and colors on them, as far as I could remember. Then later, describing that to my mother still as a child, she said, that sounds like an ancestor of mine from the 19th century who was a rabbi and wore all black. In later years, some psychic, and I'm not big on psychics, but a few of them seem to be able to tell some truths, said to me, oh, you had a rabbi ancestor as a child who taught you tarot cards.
Taught you tarot cards in your dreams.
So he apparently was teaching me tarot cards, not using tarot cards, but using symbols. But I didn't know that. All I knew was that when I was 9 years old, I went shopping with my mother one day, and we walked past a shop that had tarot cards in the window, but they'd been taken out of their box and were just like spread out on display. I didn't know, but at that time, the CNA group controlled all publications coming into this country, and they didn't allow books and things of tarot cards. So I think these people, and a lot of people, try to keep that low, because if you got on the wrong side of the CNA, you weren't allowed to bring in any books in your bookshop, because they controlled that whole industry. It was unusual to find tarot cards in the window. And I said to my mother, those are tarot cards, I want them. And she said, well, you're not getting them. But we did have a rule in our family that said, if you pay for it yourself, you can have it.
So what was her objection? Was it about the cost, or was it about tarot and what tarot represented?
It probably wasn't about tarot, because she probably didn't really know.
Okay.
But she knew there was some weird thing that might be to do with fortune telling. Not that they had any issues around those things per se. She would have just thought, I don't waste my money on that.
Right.
That's probably what it was. And that money was R14.95, which in 1972 was a lot of money.
It was.
So I went home and I broke open my money box, and there was R14.95 in it.
Oh, my word.
And the reason I remember it so well is because my grandmother had taught us that you don't take your last 5 cents out of your money box. You can't leave an empty money box, otherwise it's never going to have money in it. You've got to leave 5 cents so that more money will come. And I remember having this crisis of, do I ask my mother for the 5 cents? I was proud. No, I'm just going to use the last 5 cents. It's going to be fine. So I used the whole R14.95. I think my pocket money was 5 cents a week. And for 5 cents, I could get a Coke, a packet of chips, and a sweet.
There you go.
I can't even remember how did you do that, but obviously that's how it worked. I went and I got the tarot cards, and I couldn't afford a book on how to read them because the cards were just cards. And the book on how to read them was R6.95.
Oh dear.
But somehow I knew, I don't know how I knew, it felt like I'd been told, but I was 9 years old, I can't have been told, that if you sleep with the cards under your pillow every night, they will teach themselves to you. That's what I did. I put them under my pillow every night for 2 years before I did another step. And at the end of that step, I completely felt that I knew how to read tarot cards.
Fascinating.
And I started reading them. I remember making this huge big sign, tarot card readings done here, putting it in my parents' flat. I don't know who I thought I was going to, but obviously friends who didn't know what I was doing, and they were also 11 years old and thought, okay, but I got my practice in.
Interesting.
And I would find the odd, adult parent who was fascinated that because I was a child, maybe there's something special in there. And so I learned to do tarot cards, and to this very day it feels as natural as speaking a language to me because I learnt it that way. And I still tell people, put them under your pillow. It definitely worked for me, and the vast majority of what I know about them I've since verified by reading books, but I have also my own idiosyncratic things that have come out of that. And I later learned that was part of the Sangoma thing, because it was later when I finally started training as a Sangoma that the Sangomas told me I'd been trained as a child.
Yes, I remember you talking about how your tools of divination were coming from your Western ancestors, and so they were different to some of the more traditional methods used by Sangomas.
Being the tarot cards. Because I started spontaneously, as it were, growing herbal medicines when I was 15, because I read a book about them.
So we're not talking marijuana here?
No, my parents definitely thought it was. Because I just made these lush plants happen. I mean, I made a garden. I had much greener fingers than I had now, unfortunately. Now it's an effort for me to grow things. But I just remember then, I had to continuously convince them that I wasn't growing weed. I was just blown away by this concept that plants can heal people. So it was when I was first exposed to it. And I just thought, everyone needs to know this. Everyone needs to do this. Why aren't people doing this? I couldn't believe it. Why aren't we doing this? When I was 19, I was in my second year at university. It was Wits University, and studying psychology. And we had this lecturer. He was also just some kind of strange renegade. He was left-wingy, obviously, like that university, but he also just had his own ideas on everything. So his psychology classes, for example, note-taking was forbidden. And he would always have incense burning and music playing.
Only at Wits.
Only at Wits.
Yeah.
At least, this is why I came to Wits. At least they had some of that going on. The big psychology assignment for him was poetry. At one point he said, okay, now we have to learn how psychology is done in Africa. So he organized a whole bunch of Sangomas to come to the campus. He took one of the rooms in the social sciences
Quite forward-thinking
building.
for the time.
Very. There were like at least 5 of them. He knew them.
Did they come dressed in full
They
regalia?
were in huge regalia. He converted a room in the social sciences building into rural Africa. There were rocks and rockeries and plants. I don't know how they did that and how he got permission to do that. And then everyone had to go and see the Sangomas. So I went to see them, and it was my turn. I remember I actually put 5 rand under the mat as I walked in, and then just sit there. They shook the bones. I had to blow into it, say my name, and then they threw the bones out. And immediately he was like, oh, he said. And he looked and he said, this one bone, and he pointed, it was a stone, and it was green, and the other side wasn't. And he showed me how it can't easily land with the green side showing. And he said, so it must be true. I said, what? He said, you've got medicine in your garden. That's what it means. I said, yes, I grow medicine in my garden. Okay, it goes on. He says, oh, and I see you're a Sangoma and you read bones. I said, no, you're meant to be a Sangoma. But then eventually all 5 of them were sitting in front of me because they were fascinated by what was going on. And I said, I don't read bones. He said, you do read bones. I said, no, well, I read cards. He said, those are European bones. Because I assume bones literally always just meant bones.
Yes.
And includes that, but it includes lots of things. Stones, keys, dice, and why not cards? And it's something that I would eventually learn even when I did my master's about African spirituality and why it was so easily colonized was because it's got this very open approach that if it works, we're going to use it. So African medicine works that way and African spirituality works that way. Just because they're cards, so what? So they said, no, those are my bones. I must continue to use them. They did actually teach me how to do traditional African bones eventually. They did say I must use my cards because my ancestors gave those to me. And of course, which was true.
So here you are at university studying psychology, and a bunch of Sangomas come onto the campus and throw bones and tell you that you are a Sangoma, that you have medicine in your garden. How does that land?
Well, because I'd already been that child that had all these things going on, I thought kind of, okay, it felt like more it was an honorary way of recognizing that I'd been one of these unusual children. I didn't know how unusual I was. When I was in grade 8, so that's the beginning of high school, I started selling information about my teachers to the other kids. And I'd find out someone's birth time. I mean, I can't imagine what my astrology was when I was 13 years old. But at any rate, it was my thing. It's like, oh, I know secrets about them. So I understood that they were acknowledging that in some way. But I didn't know how important it would be in my life because I was busy entering the world. I was at university, learning how to be a psychologist. Astrology was now just this hobby on the side. But they said to me, you need to be fixed because you weren't trained properly. You were trained by your ancestors, but you were never graduate. And so that's where I resisted because they put beads on me, but I already had hair down to my backside. I never ever wore shoes. I was a hippie already. So I had long hair. They gave me beads. What more could a hippie want than beads? So I was fine with all of that. And the Sangoma thing was just this honorary word. They said, no, be here next week and please bring medicine with you. So I said, no, I've got no money for this. And they said, 3:00, don't be late. They just completely ignored everything I said.
Gosh.
So I thought, it's fine. I'm just going to get out of the room. So eventually I got out the room and bumped straight into that lecturer. And he said, how was it? So I told him that they told me I was a Sangoma and I'm supposed to be there next week. But it's all this honorary thing because he said, you will be there next week. So the following week I went with a big bag of medicine from my garden, and they were blown away by the plants that I had and how healthy they were. I started visiting them in Soweto, and which was a whole other political thing, because white people weren't supposed to be in Soweto. So I used to go in this panel van that had painted windows so that no one could see me, and we'd drive through the streets of Soweto. They'd come and fetch me in Orange Grove and describe what we could see, and they would always drive past a house that I never saw. They would say, this is where the white Sangoma lives. Turned out, after many years, that she was Ray Graham, a woman who became the mayor of Johannesburg in 1994. And then I met her when she was 85. But she changed my life in between. She wrote an autobiography called White Woman Witch Doctor that I stumbled across. I had bilharzia, a parasitic disease, without knowing that I had it. And she described it in her book. And when I read it, I thought, I've got that. And I went and got diagnosed, and I did. So it was quite a powerful book for me, because she changed her life. And she wasn't that interested in the fact that her autobiography had changed my life. But from her stories, I realized she's the one who owned that house in Soweto that I used to drive past all the time. So it was a strange confluence of, it was always there. Everything was always just sitting there waiting for me. Usually, when people have a calling to be a Sangoma, it manifests itself as illness.
Yes.
Both physical and spiritual or emotional illnesses. But actually, the reason it does that is because it's resisted for so long.
Right.
So the longer you resist it, the more it will manifest as some form of pathology. When it does come up in a child, obviously in an African situation, normally that would be recognized. But what happens usually to those children is the parents will appeal to the ancestors to wait. So that child eventually will get sick. What happened with me was that because my parents were letting me just follow my interests, kind of hobnobbing with angels. One night I woke up in the middle of the night, I must have been about 7 or 8 years old, and there was this angel sitting on my bed. And I can remember it like it was yesterday, because it was like nothing I've ever seen. It was a being made out of light. She turned, she saw that I'd seen her, and she just, without touching me, she moved me right back onto the bed, and I fell asleep.
Wow.
She was sitting with her hand behind her on the bed looking at me. So the next morning there was this handprint burnt into the blanket. I go running to my mother and say, look, there's an angel. And my mother says, oh no, I burnt it with the iron. Even as an 8-year-old, I felt like saying, do you think I'm stupid? I mean, I didn't say it. I just remember being a bit dazed and confused, because I was a kid. I remember thinking at the time, but firstly, it wasn't there before I went to sleep. I would have known. And secondly, I saw it with my own eyes. So, and of course, it's an adult, like it's only a dream. It's those kind of things. She didn't even process what I'd said.
Right.
She just wrote it off straight away. But it left a huge impression, and here I am 50 years later, I can remember it like it was last night. So those kind of things were kind of, I knew that was my norm. So it was all expressing itself, and I engaged with it, and that was why I wasn't ill as a calling.
I find it interesting though, and I guess maybe that's just because of my own conditioning. If I think about my life journey, when those sorts of opportunities or invitations have come, it's always been a struggle, and I've always had to kind of find the courage to follow through, and often it takes a long time, and I do get sick. So what do you think it was about you that made it possible for you to just be so open and just go along with this path?
Always been true as long as I can remember, is I've had two very clear philosophies that I've deliberately lived by. One of them was walk through the open doors. I don't know where that comes from. It sounds like a musical. But it was always walk forward. Don't hold back. There's always that assumption that things were unfolding in front of me, so just step forward. Almost like saying, if it's there, then it must be there for me, so why would I be afraid? Which is a little naive, I guess, in hindsight. And the other thing was, anything's allowed in my head, and don't judge myself on it. So if I find myself sitting there, and I think it arose out of the children thing of wanting to kill my mother, and realizing that you're not a bad person if that occurs in your head, you're not acting on it. Acting on it is the problem. So because the mind comes up with all these strange, horrible things all the time, and sometimes cruel thoughts cross your mind, or weird thoughts cross your mind. It's worked throughout my whole life. These days, it's become quite popular for people to go on these ayahuasca journeys, and they all vomit their guts out, and they face their terrible demons, and have these traumas, and they cry and perform, and they're transformed by the next day. I never have that kind of experience with anything. I've never had a bad trip of any variety or those kind of things, because I always looked at my stuff, because I had this rule that it's allowed in my head. It's not going to hurt anyone there or me. I don't know how I came up with that as a kid, but I did. I looked at my own stuff and found a context for it, but it was what allowed me from such a young age to just follow my path. At the age of 26 to become a full-time astrologer. No one does that at that age, and especially even if you do, you don't usually make it. I'm still going to have a job. But I mean, I used astrology to time it, worked perfectly in, was busy from day one.
Say more about that. You used astrology to time it?
So I used to work in a video shop in Cape Town, and I used to sit in the back of the shop doing astrological charts because the customers realized I used to sit and read astrology books. So people would ask for their charts. Eventually I would sit in the back, got students to work in the front, and one day I saw something in someone's chart that I knew would be in my chart in 6 months' time. And it means publicity and exposure. So I gave 6 months notice at the video shop. They thought I was mad. But they knew that I did astrology. I thought, okay, it's one of those weird things of him. And I remember sitting there 2 days before I left the shop thinking, what am I going to do next week? I must put a sign on the pavement with the big arrow that says astrologer. How do you do this? I was trusting of everything and fine. And that evening, a friend of mine called me up and said she's got a friend there who's a photographer with the Weekend Argus. She had mentioned that I had a computer in my house, and he was fascinated by this. It was 1989. Very few people did have, and those who did spreadsheets on them.
Right.
There were spreadsheets were there from the very beginning.
And it was still MS-DOS based.
MS-DOS spreadsheets with these green numbers on a black screen, and that's what people did with their computers. I did astrology on mine. Came around that very evening. That same day I'd been wondering what am I going to do. And then Friday was my last day at the video shop, and Saturday the Weekend Argus came out with this huge article about this astrologer. The editor took one look. Of course, he's an editor. Says people aren't interested in computers. They're interested in astrology. So he made the article, the whole thing about the astrology. So there was this huge splash of me, the video shop dude, in the Weekend Argus, the astrologer, my computer and my astrology charts, all of this. And on the Monday morning, the Cape Times, which was at that time a real newspaper, turned out there was a client at the video shop who was a journalist at the Cape Times. I didn't know. She had written an article about the guy who sits in the video shop doing astrology charts that she'd long ago submitted that they'd never used. And by coincidence, or because they saw the Argus, they put it in there on Monday morning, and they used the phone book and put my phone number at the bottom.
Wow.
So I spent my entire first day self-employed answering the phone and getting a long waiting list, and I've never looked back. And I've always said it was because that was the astrological timing. It literally means you'll be in the spotlight, that position of the moon. And there I was, both Cape Town newspapers, pictures of me, spotlight, and that launched me. So that's why, to me, the proof of astrology was me. It works, look at me.
The thing that fascinates me is that I grew up in a world where you had to have the credentials, you had to get your degree, and then that legitimized whatever it was that you wanted to practice. So you've got your degree from WITS and you hang up a shingle as an astrologer and you believe you can earn an income from this. Was there any doubt?
Something that might have helped let go of the need for that kind of official accreditation was when I was in my third year of psychology. Being WITS, we did Marxist psychology. And Marxist psychology said that psychologists just put people back into little boxes so they can be part of the productive machine. So I read that as a youngster. I thought, of course, oh my God, I'm not going to be part of that horrible thing. So I began to feel disenchanted about psychology, even though I still had the momentum to go into the honors year. I didn't finish that honors. I didn't know what to do. I was going to be a psychologist. Firstly, I have problems with it now. There are political problems. And also, I had done astrology all my life, and it consistently seemed to me that astrology was just much clearer on its ability to describe people. And psychologists all seemed to be fighting about whose theory was right. And I always used to worry, how does the patient know about that? What if the patient chooses the wrong kind of psychologist? It used to bite the hell out of me when I was at university. No one could explain what do we do about that. So I really had that issue. And astrology somehow managed to contain that. Definitely, I had the advantage of being very sensible and down to earth and male. And because we live in this patriarchal society and women are often seen as second-class citizens or lesser in some way. When a woman is interested, it's that weird stuff, she's the housewife, or whatever they categorize as, it's not real, it's not important, it's not a job. But a man doing it gives them pause for thought and realize, okay, well, maybe it's serious. So I knew from the beginning that works in my favor. That must be because I'm male. I'm not airy-fairy. I don't believe in almost anything. so that made me even more credible. But you talk
to the ancestors and you do astrology.
So the reason why I'm not all airy-fairy is because I'm an earth sign, Capricorn. And the same thing says, well, if something works, then I will use it. Doesn't really matter why it works, just it works. So that's why astrology and talking to the ancestors, to talk about the Sangoma thing, Sangomas talk to the ancestors. Hindus believe in karma. They actually do talk to the ancestors as well, but it's a very different philosophy of what I perceive the same thing. They're two different cultural tools to deal with how the past bears down on the present. So there's your family, the ancestors, and the things you brought up with and taught to believe that you get in the ancestral culture. So probably karma or ancestors are both not true. So we perceive things, we make a model out of it and a belief out of it. Whatever the real truth is, that maybe we'll never know. But the model works.
There's a lot of talk even now about intergenerational trauma and the need for intergenerational healing, both on an individual and a collective level. What's your understanding of that and why it's maybe coming up more in the public domain now?
I think what is happening generally, and this might be connected, but I think people are discovering that old answers don't work anymore. As we understand, I think more and more the complexity of how trauma affects us physically and emotionally and spiritually, but we no longer have the simplistic Freudian style model that says, oh, it was your parents when you were 3 years old and that's it. So because we've moved on from that, I think we're looking further. But what I also think, consciously or unconsciously, we're beginning to loosen some of the bonds of our beliefs in time and space, and we're understanding that those things are a bit flexible and variable. We live in a world where it can talk to anyone at any time and anywhere in the world, so time zones are kind of breaking down, and we are constantly looking for answers. All these early ideas of how the past is related to the present, and I think the real truth is the mysterious Einsteinian truth that there is no time, that there is only the eternal present. If that is a truth in some form, it must keep on trying to show itself.
There's one or two things that kind of stand out for me. So the one is around your training as a Sangoma, which is a little bit unconventional. And the interesting thing about that for me is how you find a way to blend these two cultures in who you are in the world and how you live that. And then the other was the story you shared with me about the Sangoma you met with when you were doing your research for your master's degree, and where you had the conversation about why more and more white people are being called to the training and becoming Sangomas in South Africa.
That was actually the topic of my thesis, so I'll get back to that. Let me just answer your first question. Firstly, as I said, I didn't have the illness of the calling. So they recognized that I had responded to my ancestors, but no one had turned it into methodology. For a year, I would go to their house on weekends in Soweto, and they would teach me the practical side.
Well, I think in most shamanic traditions, the idea is that there's kind of two paths to getting to the destination. The one is the learning the tools of the trade, and the other is the personal journey and some kind of initiation, some kind of confrontation with death that qualifies you to be a healer.
So all of those things exist in the African shamanism. One of the fundamental things, in terms of their perspective of what the process is doing, the process is all about learning to connect to the ancestors. With me, the evidence was clear that I really was connected to the ancestors and could hear and respond to them. So I just needed the tools of the trade.
Interesting. And so you never went through the rituals of
I didn't go through
animal sacrifice?
Any of that drama, no.
Interesting.
Subsequently, I've had to deal with lots of animal sacrifice, which has always been hard as a vegan.
Yes,
but,
I can imagine.
But I would eventually discover the inclusiveness of African culture. No one ever judged that. The assumption was always what your ancestors want for you is what's right for you. So if that's your process, then that's your process, because it was clear that I was a complete Sangoma. So I became a Sangoma in 1982. When I did the master's degree, by then, in the 2000s, there was already a lot of white Sangomas. I knew that there always had been. Apart from Ray Graham, who became a Sangoma in the 50s, and I knew from having read history that there were white Sangomas as early as the 1700s in this country, because the pondos typically, especially, but not only other causes presumably as well, with shipwrecks, a couple of people would survive and make it to the shore, and they were generally absorbed in and accepted into their society. One of them became a queen, famously. That's why, to them, there were always white Sangomas. So I did this research. Are there more white Sangomas now? And if so, does that represent any change in the cosmology? Because the cosmology dictates how people become Sangomas. The bottom line was that, firstly, there have always been white Sangomas. It's not new. But basically, the reason why is not a change of their cosmology. It's because white people are finally learning to listen to their ancestors and respond.
That's what I remember you saying.
And that was very powerful, because that's like they knew this all the time. And when are these poor white people going to wake up? And they stood there enduring, and their understanding always was that the reason why white people are doing this is because they can't connect to their ancestors. So they don't have guidance, and they're confused and are becoming wicked. And that was why, as I understood it to a very large extent, why black African people didn't respond with violence and overthrow. And people always said, why do they just stand there and take it? And it was because they had morals and ethics. That's why they weren't going to lower themselves to the level of the white people who were no longer hearing their ancestors. One woman was telling me, when I was training, and in the early days, the Twazas, that's training Sangomas, used to have to eat off the floor. She said we would make a depression in the dung, the floor, and they would have to eat off the floor. Now they eat on plates. Still not allowed to use knives and forks, but they eat on plates. Because everyone was denying the influence of white people on their spiritual culture the whole time. So I said, the white people brought the plates.
Plates, interesting.
No one forced us to use them. The white people brought the plates. We chose to use them. So that was also very powerful for me to understand that, and also to understand why, as a white Sangoma, especially in the rural areas, no one ever saw the color of my skin. I mean, sometimes, especially in modern times and in the city, some people are surprised it's a white Sangoma. But then they quickly realize, well, of course, I guess there have to be white Sangomas because the calling is the calling. And African culture famously says, if you scratch the skin, we all bleed red. There is no color. In the Transkei, no one blinks when they see a white Sangoma. They don't suddenly start speaking English or Afrikaans to you either. They just see you as one of them. It was a very big lesson from a young age in the apartheid era to realize that black people didn't see me as different to them, and that they treated me with respect, not because I was a white person, because I was like them. There was a lot of learning in that. I was so fortunate. I do know from when I did the research for my master's that I found documents from 1800 that bemoaned how the traditional culture is completely lost already from European influence, and that's 200 years ago. So the chances of us finding any authentic idea of what it was like before colonization are unbelievably small.
Left field question. How do you know a calling is a calling?
That's a great question. I was once actually invited to Valkenburg to teach the difference to the staff there. You know, Valkenburg's always been a very open-minded hospital. When it's mental illness, many of the symptoms look like mental illnesses, but the kind of difference can be, to use a very obvious example that I told them, when they've got someone who's having a psychotic episode, included in however they behave will be things that are clearly not acceptable to their ancestors. For example, someone might smear feces on the wall. That's not a calling, because the ancestors can't direct someone to do that, because you never debase yourself or the environment, ever. So that we know, okay, that's clearly not a calling. I taught them how to spot those differences. What would the grandparents say? Does that fit into how they think things are okay, or is this a sick person? But if you're having a psychotic episode where you just say ranting in gibberish, that's a sick person, because that isn't hurting or offending the environment or other people. So that's one of the main ways, you know. Not responding to treatment. So like for physical illnesses that don't respond to treatment, that's a sign of a calling. And there are also like hidden clues you look for. So even in the person, whether they're psychotic or dissociated in some way, they'll do things which we recognize as Sangoma type things. To make up a silly example, because I can't think of one better, collecting things that are white, that would be a sign of a calling. So a lot of the language, so in this case, the Xhosa language for this part of the country, is only used by Sangoma. But mostly you use your Sangoma magic powers. So diagnosis includes feeling the other person. So they describe it as reaching in, feeling, and bringing it back into you. And so you can feel when someone has the calling. And to this day, I mean, I can be standing on a sidewalk and start feeling that. And I know there's someone standing behind me or next to me who is either a Sangoma or who has got the calling. And I look around, I look for beads, I'll always find them.
Will you point it out to somebody who maybe isn't obviously wearing beads and might not know that this is their destiny?
By African culture, strictly speaking, you are obliged to. European culture is the opposite. It's like you don't tell something they don't ask. In African culture, that is outrageous. Someone's sick, they don't know they're sick, you know you're not telling them. What happens if it gets worse?
Right.
You're obliged to tell them, you're the doctor, you know. It's ritualized, so you're ask someone, do you want me to take your side? Do you need privacy? There's something I need to tell you, so that you're forewarning them that way. And then usually in African culture, you won't want privacy.
And for the person who's out there right now, feeling a bit lost and confused, and maybe having been told here and there that there may be some kind of calling, there may be, and who's possibly experiencing a mental illness or some kind of chronic condition, not responding to treatment. Coming back to Amy's question, how does that person know if this is a calling?
So that person needs to visit a Sangoma to find out. And to find a good Sangoma is not easy, because there are plenty people who are either charlatans outright or who are half-trained. It's similar to what you find with the circumcision ritual that's gone so horribly wrong because of modern times. So you get chances and people taking advantage and people who aren't traditional surgeons. So that person, I would suggest that they speak to a few people in their community about, do you know Sangomas, who's reliable? It's very much, as all traditional medicines are, word of mouth. The important thing to know when visiting a Sangoma that will also help ensure that you don't find the wrong Sangoma is you don't say why you're there. They must tell you why you're there. Then you know that they're the real thing. So,
very different to our medical model.
Very. Their proper model is you don't say why you're there. Even if you're there for a physical ailment, it's not a calling. You're there for a physical ailment. You don't report the symptoms. They've got to tell you what the symptoms are and give you the medicine. And then when it works, you pay. And of course, that no longer exists. Even in African culture, that doesn't happen anymore, because they entered into a world of extreme capitalism. Don't go on your own. You didn't have your arm twisted very easily on your own. So you go with someone who is witness. Family members are best, but anyone you trust, that person can ensure that you don't reveal the information yourself and that you're not led down the garden path. And there is that openness as well. Yeah. There's a strong tendency in the West to stigmatize almost any kind of illness, as if it's somebody's fault that they're ill. And in African culture, you must speak about it. And then we all know. And then it's fine. We can understand why you're behaving that way, so no one's going to judge you.
And you can access the support that you need.
Exactly.
With regards to the calling/astrology, I mean, it's all about who you are, essentially, right? It's tools to help you find out who you are, what you should be doing. Are you on the path? Are you not? These are all different tools to do that. It's a difficult question, and I'm not expecting the finite answer. But the question is, in terms of astrologically, will you always end up on the path that you're supposed to be?
Great question. I was going to ask about destiny.
How, if you are a fire sign but you're acting like a water sign because things have gone terribly wrong in your life, or somebody tells you this is the kind of person you are, you should be doing this is your thing, and you go no because you're so resistant to whatever it is.
The baseline idea of a human being, whether it's spirit or astrology or whatever you want to explain drives us to who we are, is you are born to be this exact person. Your job is to be this person as fully and as best as you possibly can. You don't have the freedom to be any other person, but you do have free will. So you can veer off anywhere you like, but nothing will work except being that. The purpose of the astrology and of the Sangoma is to tell you, to mirror you and say, this is who you are. If you will try and be that as best as you can, you will be as contented as you possibly can be. You're free to go off and be something else, you're going to struggle and suffer. And it's the same with anything. We're not born to fly. Nothing stops you jumping off a building and trying. And you might even make some mechanical things to stop yourself killing yourself, but you're still never going to succeed at flying.
By design, you're not a bird.
You're not a bird. And those kind of things. We don't even have to visit the psychologist or the astrologer or the Sangoma or anyone who has to reflect us to who we are, because we will naturally be that if we learned how to be comfortable with who we are, which as modern people we aren't. But if we learn to accept ourselves, and doesn't mean resign ourselves, it's not at all the same thing. Accept myself and my context, we'll have much more satisfaction. That's always the purpose, to try and locate you where you work best.
The way that I think about it is that, for example, an acorn, even in the acorn state, has the potential within it to become an oak tree. But if you never plant that acorn, then it never becomes an oak tree. It's about allowing that template to unfold. But it does have to be in the right environment. Exactly. And it has to be nourished so that it can grow into that template.
Exactly. And as human beings, and probably as other creatures as well, we can also add consciousness into it and engage with that, own who you are. And that means align your consciousness with the facts, and then you'll be happier, because it doesn't mean you resign yourself, it means you realize you're in charge of it.
For the short time that I did people's astrology natal charts, which is a chart for the time that you're born, I remember having that same experience myself the first time I came to see you. When you tell people what their chart reveals, more often than not, they go, oh, yes, I knew that. Yeah, oh, yeah, that describes me perfectly. So, we do have that innate understanding of who we are. But,
we do.
But certainly, I know personally that environment can condition you to not live true to that. And that some of the work for me, certainly as an adult, has been to begin unpacking how that conditioning has shaped who I am, both my sort of family environment and the cultural environment I was raised in, but also the educational environment and medical school and everything that sort of programmed me to accept as what was okay and what was not okay.
No, absolutely. And because astrology allows for that self-reflection, I always compare it with a mirror. We all look into the mirror every single day, and if you think about it too much, why? You know exactly what you look like, so you're not going to find anything out. And secondly, sadly, the mirror doesn't tell you anything that you can change. It tells you what you can't change. It says, sorry for you, here you are.
Right.
And so it reflects your genes back at you. And so the purpose isn't to resign yourself and say, okay, well, I look like that. The mirror, instead of saying, okay, well, sorry for you, this is your hair, it's actually saying, go brush your hair.
Yes,
because this
look
is your
acceptable.
Hair. If you brush your hair, you can get the job, you can get the date, but you haven't changed one hair gene. If you then think, okay, now my hair's brushed, I'm fantastic, tomorrow you're going to look like an idiot. So you have to look in the mirror again and brush your hair again. But as long as you keep on doing that every day, you are the master of your destiny.
Remembering that the mirror reverses your image, actually.
Exactly.
So you're never really seeing a true image.
Consciousness is always required. The mirror isn't the truth. You're still the truth. So you've got to keep on bringing it back to yourself, but keep on understanding I am who I am. So my job is to be that. People always ask, what is my purpose? And I always want to say, what kind of cruel vision do you have of this universe that it would be that you get born with a purpose and no one tells you what it is? How would that ever make sense in anyone's universe? Whether it's a God in control of it or if nature in control of it, it just makes no sense. Surely your purpose must be to be what you were born as and try and be that as best as possible. And that really doesn't mean, okay, I'll just accept this one thing. It just means locate your consciousness back at yourself, self-reflect, keep on using the mirror and maximize what works well in your life, minimize what doesn't, but don't pretend you're something else because that isn't going to work for you.
I think the problem is we've conflated purpose with something that we do in the world. It's so endemic in our culture that when we meet people, we say, what do you do? We don't ask, who are you? And when kids are young, what are you going to be one day? And it's defined by an external thing. So the idea that purpose is the essence of who you are and just being that in the world and being more of that in the world is something that I think people don't always grasp. And often when people are saying, what's my purpose, is what am I supposed to be doing in the world?
That's true. I mean, it makes me think of, I often also compare this idea of you're born who you are with a rose. A rose is born as a rose. And a rose could sit there thinking, what if I'm supposed to be a daffodil? What if...
Why is the orchid more pretty than me?
Why is the orchid more pretty than me? When do I flower? Are they going to come and tell me? Who's going to tell me when I should flower? What should I do about it? And sit and worry about all of that. It's going to flower anyway and be a rose. If the rose was concentrating on, I'm going to be the best rose in town, it's going to look amazing and smell amazing and we can't really tell why. But when we pick that rose, we don't say, what can I use this rose for? We just say, oh, rose. We let the rose be the rose. But yet, as you say, that's what we should be doing with ourselves.
And to use your metaphor, in my mind, in this fantasy where the rose is questioning what it should be doing and when, it's still being a rose while it's doing all of that.
Exactly,
But it's missing out on the opportunity to just embrace being a rose.
Well, it's like the very corny line, we're human beings, not human doings.
Yes, exactly.
But that's true.
So talking about destiny leads me to think about transitions or cycles of change and how we can't grow into more of who we are without navigating the different cycles of life and cycles of birth and death at different stages of life. And astrology has a beautiful map for explaining those different cycles at the different stages of our evolution. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I think it is something that we've recognized since forever, but kind of forgotten along the way. So, for example, we know culturally we can look everywhere and see our ancestors talking about 7-year cycles. We even see it reflected elsewhere in our culture cultures, we talk about the 7-year itch in a marriage. We recognize a lot of those cycles still, but we've lost our celebration of them. We used to have rituals at certain times of life that were really recognitions of cycles that we go through as human beings. And we've disconnected ourselves from those. So people often feel the victim of change instead of understanding that change is a natural cycle. All cycles, their quarters produce change. Quarters of the year or the season. It's almost like for what's appropriate when. So things like the identity cycle. The identity cycle is a 21-year cycle in astrology. And that also helps us understand that we need to redefine who we are every 21 years, which is something that, because we don't, we often have a crisis instead. So someone defines themselves finally at the beginning of their 20s. Finally, I'm me, I can leave my parents, off I can go, and then reaches the end of the 30s, the early 40s, and doesn't feel like that person anymore, feels that life has become a rat race, feels like adulthood is a letdown, which where identity forces itself back to the center. Because the great thing is that even when we're not conscious, these things still will unfold. But consciousness engaging with it changes the nature of the experience. So if we understand that there's a new identity cycle beginning around 42 years old, then we can properly work at what can I let go of about my identity, about my experience as an adult that I realize doesn't work for me or isn't my identity or that never worked. How can I embrace the new? When do I allow myself to embrace the new? Astrology is essentially saying that other thing our ancestors said, there's a time for everything. The mystery of time is that it makes change and yet it's forever. Just like someone who's planting by the seasons or knowing our own seasons of life, work on our individual schedule, work with different parts of our being from identity to results to whatever. In fact, I think that's the most important and powerful and rewarding use of astrology for people, is aligning yourself properly with time so that it does things like we don't feel the victim of change. It allows us to take the initiative and to know when it's going to work.
And maybe also just to clarify that the idea is that there is a collective cycle that the whole world is experiencing, but there is also an individual cycle that each one of us is experiencing, and there is an interaction between the two.
Absolutely.
And the way that I understand it is that your birth date is the beginning of your cycle. So every year on your birthday, you're entering the spring of your seasons.
Say the pandemic. The pandemic is part of a pandemic stroke war cycle that occurs every 38, 39 years or so. They vary each time around because the cycles are not perfect circles. The planets don't work that way. And that means every 38 years or so, there's either a pandemic or a war or something of that kind of disaster level that forces society to start making changes. And out of that, the new society emerges, and it happens every often enough to us realize it's an eternal cycle. It's not like, finally we've arrived. You know, there's this error that we make of the arrow of time, that we think everything is always progressing, everything is always better than what was before, and that finally we've arrived at the point where we're no longer subject to, whether it's the superstitions, the viruses, you name it. And of course that's never true. We're never at the end of anything, just another cycle. It's always amazing how quickly we forget. Everyone screams as if this is the first pandemic, and there was one 38 years before, which was the AIDS pandemic. And we can even learn to personally engage instead of even feeling the victim of history. Although you can do nothing about it, if you understand what is the context of that cycle, you can at least say to yourself, as a human being who's on the planet during this moment in history, if I understand what this moment in history is about, how can I try and align myself to feel less pain? Some of them might even be able to contribute something, but even if that's a tiny minority, it doesn't mean you have to. But at least you can align yourself so you don't have to feel pain, you don't have to look for answers outside. I think the reason why people look for conspiracy theories is we always have to blame someone or something. And instead, if we find that it's a natural thing and there's a role for each of us in being there at that time, it just means align yourself, adjust yourself. I think the pandemic cycle is about, like they all are, is really about the old things die and the new things get born. So it's about new ways to do things. In the case of this cycle, you saw it because of how all the technologies were challenged and how suddenly how we worked didn't work anymore. We have to change how we work because it is unmistakably killing the planet. So the pandemic, if you think about it objectively, it made people work from home, use computer technology for that, not fill the streets with traffic, not have to have 2 offices, using twice as many resources and costing extra rent and all that nonsense. So the pandemic changes that. And hopefully, over the decades that follow, we start setting up ways that society works with our change view of time, where people work when it suits them better. Maybe they can then be productive, which is what we want all the time. The AIDS epidemic forced political changes in how extra governmental organizations, NGOs, work. The denial of AIDS led to organizing at a new level because people were dying. I'd like to say it sounds like a stretch, but it's probable that we wouldn't have arrived at an era where most countries allow gay people to marry if that politicization hadn't happened in the early 80s because of HIV/AIDS.
Right.
Previous to that, it's 1946, and it's the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. That's when people had rations and they had nothing. And so those last 4 years or 5 years of the 40s, people were destitute. They had nothing, and that's how they built that shiny world of the 50s of extreme, modern, appliance-oriented capitalism that arose out of that. It was because they had nothing and they needed to build a world where everyone had access to everything for the first time. None of this will take away the pain of being human, but all of it at least encourages us to engage with consciousness. And when we're conscious, we feel less like a victim. And when we feel less like a victim, we're way more capable of dealing with whatever is being thrown at us.
So we're talking about transitions and cycles and how to navigate those with a little bit more equanimity. On a more personal level, I know that you've recently been through quite a painful loss and a difficult cycle of loss. Tell us more about how that was for you and how some of what you've just said about how we should navigate change applied in this situation.
So that was the loss of my husband who died. I mean, it's a huge loss and had a very, very big effect in my life. But one thing that always helped me navigate it, and it was so clearly reflected in my own astrological chart, that whether we use the language of understanding it was meant to be, which is not really how I tend to put it, but it's got that quality because there it is, from the day I was born. But to understanding that somehow it's almost as if I'm talking about a natural process. So as much as I can rally against it, and it can feel like this should never happen, why did this happen to me? I know
it was a very sudden loss.
It was a very sudden loss to me. I mean, strangely enough, he knew it was coming. He was a very powerful Sangoma. He knew for a long time he was going to die then, but he just didn't tell anyone. But he prepared secretly. At any rate, I didn't know. There's that thing of me looking at my own chart. When we look at ourselves, we don't see it. It's like doctor can't diagnose herself because she won't be able to see the wood for the trees. Shouldn't, because she can go so wrong because she knows every tiny little detail. And it's, oh my gosh, she's probably going to end up with either something worse or in denial, something not so serious.
Right.
But it's not objective. So I couldn't easily see it in my own chart, but it's very, very, very much there. So I knew the 29-year cycle is the big, important chapter changer in life. And that's measured by the planet Saturn. So when Chris, my husband, died, I was 58. So the second Saturn cycle had arrived. The Saturn cycle is said to be the 2 or 3 worst years of our lives.
Lovely. I'm 56 at the moment.
It doesn't always work the same way, though. And it just depends on what you mean by worst. For example, when I was 29, I was in America being offered a job. It would have changed my life completely, and the life-changing moment became me choosing to come back to South Africa. It was just very instrumental in my life.
I got married at 29.
Right, so those kind of things are the big life events.
Oh, no, I'm lying. I got married at 22.
Yeah, so marriage, childbirth, divorce are the most common ones for 29.
I had my daughter for 58.
And then, so 58, well, see...
Just so that I can brace myself.
Well, it's interesting how much the world has changed, that we need to do research for what 58 is, because it used to be things like the last child leaves home. And so now you've got the empty nest syndrome, facing old age, retirement. So those things fit in that era. Nowadays, we've stretched ourselves and we tend to be younger in the 50s than previous generations were. And so I think for our generation of people in the 50s are more confused than people in the 50s ever used to be, because we haven't got a model of how to be 50-something anymore. It's changed too much. So we need to look again at what is 58. But it still provides a lot of those types of things where you're not so important to the world anymore. You've got to redefine yourself.
Absolutely.
And so it is one of those definition moments, but also often a big event. So the chart of birth by where Saturn sits tells us what the event is likely to be. In my chart is sitting in the area where it usually sits for a Sangoma, can mean a calling, but it's the area called loss and exile. Exile, 29 years old, I'm offered a job in another country. Loss, 58, my husband dies. But now the interesting thing is my Saturn cycle, so it sits in the house of loss. I know that at 58 I must experience loss. And for me, the planet of marriage, everyone has their own one because it's defined by the time and place that you're born. So in my particular case, my own personal marriage planet sits in the house of loss. So Saturn returns to its original position of loss and exile and finds my marriage planet there. So it knows what I must lose.
Wow.
So I can see that in my chart, although I couldn't see it before because you can't see for yourself. I don't even really look that much for myself. But when I try to understand what's happened to me and I look at that, as much as it doesn't take any of the pain away, it still makes me understand that as much as I don't like it, I am part of a bigger cycle of whether it's nature or spirit or whatever life really is. I clearly fit even with that. It's not like something went wrong. I might not like it, but nothing went wrong. It's there from the day I was born. That is my chart that was made the day I was born.
Sure.
So we can call that fate. We might not like the idea of fate and prediction, but if we accept, as we modern people, because of science do, that there is no such thing as time, then it can make sense that it's written there the day that I was born because it's already in my potential that must sooner or later manifest.
So there's a way of making meaning of that experience. How do you deal with the loss? How do you deal with the pain?
All you can do is use that meaning to try and do so. So, for example, that house of loss and exile is also the house of callings because it's the house of the personal spiritual path. As opposed to, say, following a religion. And so the chart is telling me this is located in your house, which is the area where you as a human being confront your relationship with God, spirit, whatever. So it's giving me advice to say how to deal with this, where to go, is to look inside yourself at those things and try and deal with it by means of looking at your relationship with the bigger in that way.
Right.
To respond to your calling, to understand your calling in those ways. Astrology is very real and doesn't pretend pain doesn't exist or that it can be easily removed. It just says what we know, and that is that by knowledge and acceptance is our first step to mastering and changing things.
Right.
And so it gives you that process. Otherwise, if I hadn't known the astrology, I've got a lot of that, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to him? I'm a victim of bad luck or bad fate or a cruel God or whatever. And all of those things slow down the healing process immensely. And so, although I still have to go through it, it lets me go through it in the most natural way possible.
Yes, there's also the danger that it becomes about spiritual bypassing and people almost doing but it was meant to be. It's in your chart. You're an astrologer. Why are you railing against this? And I guess it's the difference between surrendering and accepting that this is part of the natural cycle versus feeling like you are a victim of a greater force that you have no influence over and that bad things happen to you.
It's the same as knowing that you yourself will die. You can rail against that as much as you like and find it unfair, and you might try everything in your power to stop it, and none of those things are going to work except to make you more discomforted with where you're at. Whereas if you accept that you're going to die, then maybe you'll live more fully. Maybe you'll say, I love you more often. You'll do all of those things that improve the quality of your own life and without changing the objectives of fate.
I guess for me, that was very much highlighted in the years when I worked with cancer patients. And I know you know that. We did this really interesting workshop, Amy, where we invited people who were living with cancer to participate in a group astrology reading. And it ended up happening on 2 different occasions. So we had 2 different groups of about 12 people. And Rod drew a chart for each group that then linked their charts with my chart, because I was their doctor. That was what they had in common, and what the chart revealed about their illness. And it was really fascinating in terms of the collective experience of cancer, but also my role in that, how the one group was very much there to teach me more about life and about cancer and about illness, and the other group was there to learn from me what I knew about cancer and healing.
And it was really beneficial for them, I remember.
Yeah, it was very profound.
Getting that knowledge and that perspective on things. And I think, and that's what understanding our own transitions does. And, you know, although I still every day had to deal with all the emotion and all of that, and I couldn't sit and think, okay, well, my chart says it's okay, so it's okay. It's not that. At least it allows the responsibility for where you're at in all of this to come back to you. Because as long as I think God, fate, and nature are responsible, I can never heal myself. I'm not responsible for Chris's death, but because it's in my pattern of unfolding, then I can be responsible for how I unfold.
Yes, that's beautiful. On a final note, we're talking about individual loss and grief and the way you've dealt with it yourself and what the charts reveal about that. You mentioned earlier about how the way we're living is destroying the planet. And one of the things that a friend and I, she's very passionate about climate activism and people waking up to what's happening in the world. She and I often argue about the fact that in my mind, even the planet has a natural cycle that includes birth and death. And that, yes, of course, we've done things to pollute the planet in the same way that we do things to pollute our bodies, but death is inevitable. Would you agree that there is something about that that could be true for the planet, or do you see the cycles of how the planet is evolving and growing differently?
No, I would agree with you. I do think that, falling back on Einstein, everything is just one thing. We call it the universe. It's an interesting word because, you know, the Greeks called it the cosmos, and cosmo means beauty, whereas universe means one thing. The Romans called it the universe. And so the universe means it's the one thing. I still prefer the Greek word because the Greeks say it's the beautiful thing. It encompasses the mystery of it. But the Romans, being Roman and very controlling and masculine, it's one thing, it's ours. It doesn't mean, again, that we can just, okay, it's fine.
Just let it die.
Let it die. Because it's like when people say, why eat healthy foods when you're still going to die anyway? And it's the quality of life while you're alive that you care about.
Exactly.
If we understand the equality of everything, because everything is one, then I must treat the earth the way I treat the most precious things in my life. If I'm treating the earth badly, I'm treating myself badly, my mother badly, my cat badly.
Well, isn't that the dilemma, that we don't see ourselves as one with the earth?
It would change everything.
Anything you want to ask, Amy?
This conversation could go on for a very long time.
It could. I'm very aware of...
But considering that we've talked about the universe, cosmos, our place in it, destiny, fate...
Where else is there to go?
Yeah, I think we're pretty good for a Friday afternoon.
For a Friday
I think we're good right now.
Absolutely. Rod, thank you so much for making the time for this conversation.
Thanks,
and for sharing so generously of your own life and your own experiences.
It's a great pleasure.
It's always lovely to chat with you and to learn more about your story.
Thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure.
I'm Dr. Maria Christodoulou, and you've been listening to the Awakening Doctor podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your friends. Follow Awakening Doctor on Instagram, Facebook, and Spotify, and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, rate, and give us a good review. Thank you so much for listening.